In this video, we're going to be building a modular trigger that you can reuse in all your projects. So you don't have to make the same little trigger volume and resize it, whatever. We're going to make a trigger volume that you can actually give it a color, right? You can give it a transparency. You can see that there's no mesh renderer on here, so you don't even have to worry about seeing your mesh renderer when we press the play button, because we're going to do this with Gizmos. You know, we're going to add some filters here, so it could be one shot or not. It could detect certain layers, a certain object, whatever. We'll talk about Unity events. So then you'll be able to reuse this in your own projects and hopefully save yourself a little bit of time. And you can take this and continue to expand on it, after this video if you like. Okay, let's start building our modular trigger. So first thing is I'm going to come into my scene here. I'm going to make a 3D cube. I'm going to start with this. I think that's fine. I'm going to relabel this trigger. So first thing we need, we're going to make a script. We'll call this trigger volume. And I'm going to attach my trigger volume onto my trigger collision. Now, there's a couple things here that we'll probably want to do in our code, like we want to make sure that this is the correct kind of trigger and other things. Another thing that you're going to see, this has a mesh renderer. I don't really want a mesh renderer on my trigger volume, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove these. We'll talk later about how we can visualize this, but let's open up our trigger volume script. Okay, so in order to get the trigger volume sending out the notification that something triggered the volume, or maybe even something exited, we're going to use Unity events. You could also use traditional C# events if you want, but I think Unity events are more useful for like level designers, for example, where they don't want to make custom scripts. They just want to place a trigger and then plug in a thing that happens whenever something enters the volume. So let's look and see what that means. What I really want to do here is I want to add a public Unity event, and you're going to see that this isn't what we want, but nothing really pops up. So what we can do is we can right click this and say quick actions and refactors, and it'll suggest some things for me. This is how you can fix if you forget what namespace something is in, like that. You can click it and it'll automatically add it. Or you can just add this at the top and then remember that, and then it'll complete your highlighting here. So if I finish this and say on enter trigger, like that, we come back out here. This is going to look very similar to how we have a button, where if we want something to happen when we press a button, we can create a new slot, drag in an object, and then select a method to run. So like, for example, if we wanted to turn off our direction light, we'd select either a script or a component, and then we just choose the method that we want to happen. So that's the neat thing about Unity events, is that we can just create multiple things to happen. What do I want to happen? Drag this object in, run this method on this component on this object, and then that will happen if we call it right. So let's make sure that we are actually calling this correctly. I'm going to hop back into my script here. Now, just like any other collision event, we're going to say on trigger enter. Okay. You can see we get access to the collider. Now we can do some validate object up here, right? Like maybe if only certain types of things can enter the trigger. We'll do that later. For now, we can say on enter trigger, right? The name of this right here, where we want to trigger the event. Something entered the trigger, so send out the notification. Then everything that's inside of this box that's hooked in will run. So the light will turn off, the sound effect will play, and all that. It'll just run everything inside of our group of listeners inside this container whenever we call this. And this is getting called whenever something enters. So we can test that out here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create, let's make little test objects. We'll have a sphere. We'll call this player. We'll zero this. We'll add a rigid body component on it. Okay, so when I hit play, this is going to drop down and enter the trigger volume, and we should get the notification. But actually, one more thing before we do that, we're just going to leave a debug.log here. Entered. Okay, just make sure that we're calling that correctly. Hit play. Okay, our first problem is that we did not set it to be a trigger. Now here's the thing, we could set that, but if we want to make a reusable tool, maybe we actually put that inside the code itself. So for example, maybe inside of awake, because we know that this is going to be attached to a collision object, we want to make sure that this is a trigger. We don't want to rely on the designer staff to remember that to get the script to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a search for our collider here. So let's make a private variable at the top because we want to hold on to this collider and do other things in the code, and we only want to search and find it once. The concept of caching. So we'll search for a type of collider, and then here we're going to say there's nothing in the box. So on awake, get component, look for a type of collider. Okay, and then also once we find it, second step is trigger equals true. So now we don't really have to remember to do that. So check this out. So if we look at the trigger volume right here, this script on awake will do a search, it'll find the box collider, and it'll turn the trigger as true. Just like that. So we didn't have to remember to do that. So that's pretty neat. Anytime we want to automate like the boilerplate stuff, we probably want to do that. Now, another thing we can do, we can protect ourselves a little bit. At the very top here, because we're doing a search on this object to find a collider, let's guarantee that we have a collider to find. So we're going to say require component type of collider. Okay, so this just verifies that I cannot remove this script or do any changes unless there is a collider attached. So if I try to remove the collider, I can't. It won't let me because we're requiring it through script. You know, if we wanted to specify a box collider instead of just a generic collider, most triggers I can think of are box colliders, and I think that's reasonable to assume. So we'll do that, type of box collider. Okay, another thing that I want to do, just again, extra protection. I think it's reasonable to assume that we won't attach multiple trigger volumes on a single trigger volume. So I'm going to add another attribute up here called disallow multiple component. And all this does is it means that if we try to attach multiple trigger volumes onto the same object, it's just not going to let me, right? Can't add it. It's already there. Just a little tiny feature proofing right there. So we'll do that. Another thing I want to do is instead of my debug.log, I want to actually test this with something in the scene. So I'm going to remove that. Instead, let's actually turn on a test object just to show you. Make a 3D object cube, move it off to the side, something like that. We'll call this test. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this on when I enter the cube. So let's leave it off by default. If this sphere, we named it player, if this sphere enters the trigger, this will turn on. So to do that, this is how we would use our system. We'd select our trigger. Okay, we added a trigger to our scene. Hit the plus button, drag the test object. What do we want to happen? Well, we can choose any script that we added on here, but just for simplicity, I'm going to choose game object and I'm going to choose set active. If I check it, I'm going to set active true, so I'm going to turn it on. If I disable it, then I'm going to set it false. Right, so in this case, I want to turn it on because it's starting off in the off state. So when this ball player goes through the trigger volume, our trigger volume will call the onEnter trigger action, which because one of our actions that we're listening and going to perform is this game object.setAct. So basically, when the player enters this trigger volume, this will get run, which will turn the test object setActive true. So let's try it out. Okay, cool. There's a lot of other features that we can add to this. I think one feature that I want, you're already starting to see it. I can't see my trigger volume anymore now that I removed my mesh renderer, and it might be nice to be able to see these in the levels. So let's actually add some gizmos to this. Let's start to think about what we want our gizmo settings to be. I'm going to visualize this as I want my trigger volume to shade a color, and then I may want some parameters for when I want that shaded. So for example, I might want a setting that says don't even display the visual, right? It's in my way. I want to focus on my other mechanics. So maybe even display in Gizmo might be a Boolean, yes or no. If yes, then we'll we'll actually draw it and shade it. And when we shade it, we might want an option for a color. So we want like a green volume, a red volume. I may want to shade these different colors for my own designer purposes. Another thing we might want is whether to shade it when it's only selected or just keep it always shading even if the object is not selected. There's a few things that I, off the top of my head, think I want. So first we're going to make a header and we'll call this Gizmo settings. Then I said the first thing I want to know is whether or not to even shade it, even display or draw it or whatever. So we're going to call that in a Boolean called display gizmos. Default that to false. Okay, and so in order to actually make that work, there are two main gizmo settings you need. There's on draw gizmos and on draw gizmo selected. So void on draw gizmos and on draw gizmo selected. On draw gizmos will run all the time, and on draw gizmo selected will run only when we have the object selected, right? So we're going to use this later when we filter it, but at first we don't even want it to draw any gizmos if the display gizmo is false, right? So I believe this is called a guard clause, but basically at the very top, we're just going to return early if it does not meet a certain condition. So if draw display gizmos, it's false. You could also use a not symbol here. I kind of like being able to specifically see the keyword false, just helps me read it, but it's up to you. Then return. And a lot of these I like to either do in one line or just very simply, like don't use any of the brackets and stuff, just because I want this to be as clear and easy to read as possible. Same thing down here. If we're not even displaying the gizmos, just exit these methods early, right? Okay, then the next question is how do I actually draw the gizmo? In order to draw gizmos, in most cases like gizmos.draw and then you choose a shape. Probably what I want is cube. Let's look at what else. Wire cube. You know, yeah, I could do wire cube, but honestly, I think I might want the shading for the trigger volumes. I could imagine trigger volumes being very big, and being able to turn them on and off lets me control like whether or not they get in the way. So I'm gonna do not draw wire cube. I'm gonna do draw cube. Parentheses. It'll tell you what it wants. Very simply, my trigger volume is going to be its own object. So I'm gonna say transform.position. And for the second parameter, I believe it wants the size. So, you know, we could arbitrarily put a size in here, but what might be even better is to get the size directly from the collider, right? If we can get the size from the collider, then we can just resize our object however we want, and then our gizmo will draw and match that. You know, we don't want to have to change things in multiple places just to do a thing, right? So let's just pull that immediately from the collider. Now here's the trick, and let me show you what's going wrong. If I just pull it directly from the collider, I can actually say something like collider.bounds.extents. And this will pull the vector3 XYZ from the collider, which seems like it would work, right? Oh, I'm doing this I'm doing this in the wrong place. You know, follow along, but I'm just going to cut this whole line. Let's just do it in on draw gizmos first, and then once we get this right, I'll put it in on draw gizmos selected. Okay, gizmos draw cube. So this should draw the bounds and extents. So let's save that. Come here. And you're going to see a problem. The problem here, we don't have access to this, right? This underscore collider, because this is happening in awake. When we hit the play button, that's when this will run. So what we need to do is we're going to leave a little thing here just to make sure. If collider is equal to null, then find it, right? If there is no collider, we're going to do a little check here to make sure that we have a collider if we're going to use it in our onDraw gizmos. So we're just going to say, we're going to do the same thing. Component, collider. Okay, so if it's null, then we find it. And so, you know, because we're requiring that we have one anyways, right? Again, you could change this to collider if you want. You know, I might actually change it back to collider. I think it's more important that we can switch out the different kind of collider. It brings up another question. Do we really want to draw a cube if we could have a sphere collider? That's expansion in this. Don't really worry about that yet. Okay, so find the collider if we don't have it, and then draw it. And I think that might work, right? Because we know that we have it. If it's null, then find it, and so then we can draw it. If it's not null, then we won't really need to do this again. So let's see what happens. Alrighty, so display gizmos. Okay, so we have it here. It's just not displaying at the right size. So let's look and see why that might be the case. And I'm actually realizing right now that I made a mistake. It's not extents, it's size. I was saying the words correctly, but not really. So collider bounds.size. That should actually give us the size of the collider. So let's do that. There we go. So now if we come in here and we resize, we can expand our trigger and we don't have to change that multiple places. And we're just drawing this gizmo on top to define that. Now, another thing you're noticing is this color. I mean, it looks like a normal mesh. So let's actually let the designer define that color. So I'm going to come up here, serialize field, private, color, call this gizmo, color. And we could default this to something. I think color.green or something is pretty common for triggers. Yeah, so then we just need to make sure that we use this. You see if it's gray like that, then we're not using it anywhere. So we're going to copy that, come down here, change the color, gizmo color, gizmos.color is equal to gizmo color. Okay. And we'll do that right before we draw the cube. So now if we save it, come back in here. Oh, there we go. So you can see I'm not using a mesh renderer to draw this now. It's unnecessary. I don't want to remember to disable the mesh renderer when I hit the play button. I really only want this inside of my editor, right? So it makes more sense for that to be a gizmo. I can also turn down the opacity if I want, right? So I can see things through it. Pretty neat, and then I can resize it. So I think visualization-wise, that's pretty good. Another thing I might want to do is I'm going to copy all this stuff here. I'll replace that, but it's basically the same. I'm going to do the same thing in onDraw Gizmos and onDraw Gizmos selected, but I'm going to do one additional check here. We're going to call this serialize field, private bool, show only while selected equals true. I think by default, I really don't want to just see all the triggers in the entire scene. I want to be able to flag that or turn that off, for example. So let's set that to true and make sure that it's working properly. So show only while selected. Basically, we don't want to run this if only show while selected is true, right? Because this will just draw it all the time. So if it's not true, then we want to do this. If it's true, we want to do this. So we'll leave another guard clause. I believe it's called guard clause. Basically a validation, essentially. If show only while selected is true, then return early, right? So in other words, if it's checked, we don't want to draw it all the time, only draw it when it's false. So if it's true, just return. It's kind of a little backwards way to think about it, but we're going to do the opposite here. If show only while selected is false, then return. If it's true, then continue, right? So this is a pattern I like to use. Just leave my checks up top, right? Unnecessary comment, but for this video, I just want to make that real clear. I'm leaving a series of checks up at the top to make sure whether or not we even want to enter this method, and then that's how I'm keeping it clean. Okay, let's test this. So basically, if it's not selected, I don't want to see it, right? If it is selected, I do want to see it. Or I can just turn off all gizmos and just, I don't want to see it, right? Or I can leave gizmos on, but say show only while selected. Leave that off, I should see it all the time, right? So just a few little options for there. And again, if I had different kinds of triggers, this is meant to be very generic. I could change the color on that. Okay, so I think that's the visualization portion. It just helps us not have to worry about mesh render and all that other stuff because we really only want to see this in the editor. We don't want to see the mesh render for triggers. They're meant to be invisible. So let's hit play. There we go. Okay, pop that in. Let's look at something else. What if I had two players, right? or 2 of enemies or whatever you're using to test your object. What if my player can hit the trigger and then hit it again? We might want to specify whether or not that's intended, right? Because right now, what if it's trigger cutscene and you wouldn't want that to trigger multiple times, right? So in our generic trigger, let's actually rename this trigger volume. Okay. And in this thing, maybe we want to specify whether this should be able to be reused multiple times. So you think of like I don't know, a healing fountain or something. Or do you want this effect to be one shot, it's done, right? Triggering a cutscene, exit the level, whatever. I do want to set that as a parameter on my trigger volume. So we'll do that. So to do that, we're going to come into our trigger volume here. And there's really 2 ways of thinking if you want to accomplish this. I mean, the simplest thing to do would be to come in here and when something enters the trigger volume, like that, we could just disable the box collider. So if multiple things try to enter, it's not going to hit it anymore. That's probably the way that I would normally start off because it's easy, right? You turn off the collider and then nothing else can enter. The only issue with that is that if I wanted to keep expanding this trigger later on, I may want more control than that. So for example, if I did it this way, what if I wanted this trigger volume to be able to trigger 3 times exactly and then turn off? Well, turning it off the first time, it's a little more complicated. Or what if I wanted to do something on exit, for example? So you could enter and you could exit all one time. Well, if I turn off the collider, then I'm not really getting the exit calls either. So I'm getting the sense that I want to track that a little bit more in depth than just disabling the collider. This is a simple way and it's functional. So that's the first way. The second way we could do it is we could track the state using a Boolean of this object. And normally when it comes into tracking state, it can get very complicated. One Boolean is not too bad because it's either able to be triggered or not. If we got any more complicated than that, then maybe we'd talk about state pattern and different types of state for the trigger volume. I think it's fine for now, so we'll just go with that and change it later if we need to. So all I'm really going to do is I'm going to add a Boolean and say, has this already been triggered? If so, then don't allow the second trigger. If not, then allow it either way and flag it. This has already been triggered. So then I have the control. If I want to allow multiple triggers, and I can. If I want to reset it, I can do that too. So let's do that. So remember, we're going to keep track of the state using a Boolean. Has this already been triggered? If so, flag it. If not, then handle it however I need. So the first thing is we're going to leave the option here. So I want to give the player the option to flag whether or not they want to this to be a one-shot or not. And I think it's pretty common terminology to call this one-shot. Let's leave some other settings open with the header at the top. Let's call it settings. And let's do a serialized field private bool. Call this one shot. And we'll default this to true. I'm assuming most triggers are going to be one shots, but they don't have to be. So if this is true, we need to use that as a filter to make sure that if it tries to enter again, then we don't want to allow it to, right? Okay, so to do this, we need to track whether it has already entered or not. So down at the bottom, I'm going to, well, let's say right here, I'm going to keep track of a Boolean. We'll call this already entered. Default that to false just in case. Okay, now the first time that a valid object enters a trigger volume, we're going to call on enter trigger and then mark it as already entered equals true. So it's false by default. So the first time it tries to come in, this is false, 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 goes through. Then we flag it as true once we get the end. So the next time it comes in, we'll say if one shot and already entered. All right, we could actually say equals true if we want, but I think this reads better. I like to say equals false just because that is a little bit easier to read for me. But if it's one shot and it's already entered, then return. It's a one shot. It's already entered. There's no need to run it a second time. And then we have to make sure that we flag it right there. Honestly, I think that'll work. So what we could do here is we could test it. I'm going to make sure that this does not trigger multiple times. We'll just say a debug dot log entered. Like that. Okay, so we have two objects that can enter this trigger volume. It'll turn the object on. It'll do that either way. But because this is a one shot, then it should, because in our code, it should only enter once because it's a one shot and we allow it the first time, but then we mark this as true. The second time, if it's one shot and true, then we return. So we should only get one entered message here. Right? Cool. So it ignored the second object. So let's test it without. So if one shot is false and we can trigger it multiple times, great. It accepts multiple objects. So there we go. Yeah, cool. We created a little ability that we can make a one-shot trigger. So, we could play the cutscene as an example. And just to show you how you might specifically do this as a cutscene. So for example, what if you had you have an empty object? This could be called level cutscenes. I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of using like timeline or anything like that, but you could set this up. You could have your cutscenes animated, and then you could have them linked somewhere. What I really want is just some kind of level object that has a script on it. We'll call this cutscene manager or something. So we'll take our cutscene here. And just to show you how you can hook in a method on another object in the scene, we'll come over here and we'll say public void. We'll just call this play cutscene. And then you could play the cutscene, right? So debug.log play cutscene. So as long as this is public, then you should be able to call it through the trigger volume. So just to show you, the script is attached there. If we want trigger volume, and instead of doing this test object now, we could do it a little fancier. We're going to say plus, what do we want to do? We want to do something on a game object in the scene. It's the level cutscenes game object. And what component on that game object do we want? Well, the cutscene manager. And then because it's public, we can play cutscene. So now when this ball, right, the player enters, it will play the cutscene. You should see that in the console. And then you can play the cutscene however you want. So it's entered and then play cutscene. And because it's one shot, right, we're only going to play the cutscene once. So that little process right there, that's how you would actually add things to the onTriggerEnter, is you just click the button, drag in the game object you want, choose a component on that game object, and then run the method you want, as long as it's public. Now let me show you another thing. What if you didn't want to do it this way, like, play the cutscene, I have to write a new method each time I do that? Well, as another example, what if you had a music player, right? And then on that music player, you have some kind of music player script. Okay, so I'll drag that. And then inside of this music player script, you actually want to play the music. Play music, like that. Now here's the thing, you can actually give it a parameter. If we give it audio clip, right? Or if this was like take damage, you could send in the amount of damage or whatever. If I give it a parameter, well, I guess in the case of a music player, I have to do some other stuff, like need an audio source, and then I can say audio source.clip equals the new clip we give it, right? This one that we're passing in. And then we can just say audio source.play. If I really wanted to expand my example, though, I would have to do, make sure that we find this on awake. Component, audio source, right? Because music players typically loop, we'd probably want to go .loop equals true. And music typically plays from all around, so we'd say spatial blend equals 0. 0 means you can hear it from all around. Oh boy, and the last thing we do at the very top is require type of audio source. Okay, so this is just a random little example of a very simple music player. The point is, if I make this music player and I call this method, we can actually give it a clip, right? So in this example, what if our trigger volume, instead of just running a method, we could also music player. So when this ball enters, or when this player enters, music player music player, and then play music. And then we can specify a clip, right? Now, the cool thing about this is that we can use the same method, but just give it a different parameter, right? A different music clip each time. So you could have a trigger volume over there that plays a song, the same trigger volume over there playing a different song. This is how we can start to make our trigger volume reusable, because really we can duplicate these things all around our map and then just have different things happen, right? Give different music tracks. You could set up a very similar thing with your level cutscenes, right? You just choose which cutscene do you want to play. I just want to show you, you know, how to implement this and how you could do that. Okay, another little thing that I think I want inside of my trigger volume. We have the ability to make it a one shot, but what if we want to reset the trigger state at some point? So for example, what if the player were to die and we want that one shot to be able to be triggered again? Probably want some ability to reset the trigger. So we could actually come down here and leave a little method for us. Now, conceptually, one thing you could do is you could make this already entered public, and you could do it that way. But good programming practice is to not do weird variable manipulations outside of this class, and instead to think of it more as like a language, like a verb. What do you want to do to the trigger? Not just like tweak variables from some outside thing. I want to just tell it what I want, which is reset the trigger, right? Public void reset trigger. And even if we are still, in the end, only doing this thing, right, already entered equals false, we're just changing that to its default state. Even if we are only doing that, if we wanted to expand it later, now we're doing it all inside this one thing, everything related to resetting the trigger, instead of trying to find all the things that tried to, you know, do this and maybe something else. And it could be very confusing. We want to give it a command, and that is the reset trigger command. So it's simple, but you know, just to start a process there. Okay, the last thing that we're going to do is we want to do some filtering. So any of you who have used a trigger volume before, the biggest hurdle with that is that we really want to make sure that we understand what object is allowed to enter the trigger. So as an example, you may not want your enemies to be able to enter a trigger and trigger a cutscene, right? Like it would be very confusing to the player, or the enemy triggers the win volume or whatever. You do want to be able to control that specifically. So what we're going to do is we're going to come here. Oh, actually, just as a side note, you see this settings right here kind of coming up against the on trigger enter right there. You can add a little attribute to expand that. So I'm just going to say attribute space. We'll give it 10. Save that. Just kind of space it out a little bit more. So that's a little nicer to me. Okay, so there's lots of ways to filter objects. You could filter objects by name, by, you know, so a lot of people like to use tag. I don't really like using tag. You could filter objects by layer. I think that because a lot of people are using the physics system, it does make sense to filter by layer. You could actually filter by a specific object. So like we only want to allow this player, this game object in the scene to trigger this. So you might think of a key, like a very specific key, or if you know you only have one player, then that, you know, you could do that too. So I think in my mind, I want two baseline abilities of filtering. I want to be able to specify if I give it a specific object, then make sure it's that specific object in order to trigger it. Additionally, I probably want to filter by layer. So for example, if my player is in the player layer, which is hard to say, then I want to filter that. For example, I could have hazards. All my hazards could be in a certain layer called hazards. All my enemies could be in a certain layer called enemies. Now, the reason that I personally like to use layers is because if you open up your preferences, you go to physics, you can actually already filter out things in your physics systems for what can touch each other, what colliders can collide with each other inside of layers. And you probably want to do things like, you know, enemies can collide with ground, but cannot collide with other enemies, for example. A lot of times you're already going to be using layers to define certain types of things anyways. So to me, it makes the most sense to just, you know, allow that as a filter option, because now I could say, no, enemies cannot trigger this thing, or only that player, or only things marked with the player layer can do that. Okay, so that's a lot. So we're going to do two filters. One is whether or not it's a specific object, and the other is whether or not it's in a certain layer. Now past that, you can add a tagged string. I don't like tags, but if you want to do it, you can. I'll just show you the starting point for those first two options, and you can expand it however you want, because in the end, you want this to be a reusable tool that you can, keep using in your own projects. So let's do an object and a layer. The object one's going to be a little simpler to get the concept across. Layers are weird. They have to do something called a layer mask and bit shifting and stuff, and it's just, honestly, I don't fully understand it, but I'll just show you how to do it. So the first thing is pretty simple. First one is let's add a header here and call this filters. I think it makes sense to me. Okay, so our filters are, the first one is specific object. So we'll say private game object. We'll just call this specific trigger object. And we'll default this to null. Doesn't really matter. Ensure that it's null. In this case, it's going to be null by default. So if I save this, come back to my trigger volume, it's going to be null by default. But if I give it an object and it's no longer null, then I want to use that object to filter. If it's null, then I don't care, right? Like there's no defined object. I don't really want to use that to filter. So to do that, we'll come down here where we're validating the object. So we're doing one shot already entered. Okay, yep. We're going to say if specific trigger object is not null, meaning we did define something in there. It's not just an empty slot, right? There is a specified object and our other.game object. So before I finish this out, remember our other collider is the thing entering the trigger volume. So if this player falls, this is the other collider. I want to test the game object on that other collider, right? So that will test this object. So if the other.game object is not equal to, this is a little weird, but basically, if we specified something and the other game object is not the same thing as that thing, then return. Otherwise, continue, right? If it is the same as that other thing, then don't return, continue. We'll test this and make sure that it works, but that's essentially what we're saying. If we have specified something and it's the same. So if we have specified an object and it is not the same, return. Okay, and if we haven't even specified an object, then don't even bother doing the check anyways, right? Just continue. So let's try that. In order to prove that this works, we just need to save it. First, we'll make sure that it still triggers. Okay, we're getting an argument here. Okay, so I'm gonna come back here and show you part of this issue. If you have an actual audio clip here, if you were to try to put this in here, for example, so now it's not null and you hit play. You see how we're not getting those errors anymore. I think what's happening is I think Unity is trying to convert the parameter object into something generic, like it says type of object. But if you give it null, I think it's just not sure what to do. So my recommendation is if you want to pass in a parameter like that, just make sure that you do that. Even null checks for me didn't even work. So, in a worst case scenario, you don't even have to pass in parameters like that. You could just rely on, playing one-off methods and things if you want. But there are ways to make it work, and maybe try things that int values or whatever that don't do a null. So this is being kind of weird for me, so I just wanted to let y'all know that. Ooh, oh boy. Okay, so we wanted to figure out our player going through the trigger volume like this, and we wanted to specify a special object. So let's say if we only wanted this player to go through, right? We're going to turn off one shot so that we should get this twice because this is a player and this is a player. But if we have specified that only this game object will be allowed through, then even though everything else is the same, we should only get one of these, right? Because we are checking if we've specified an object and the other object is the same, then continue, otherwise return. Okay, so we're only getting one entered, so that's pretty cool, even though it's not one shot. It means it is looking at that specific object, right? What if this specific object was something else, right? Like our main camera, which doesn't even really make sense. But in this case, neither of those will be triggered. Okay, so that seems to work. So yeah, one shot gives you an option, or you can define an object in the scene, and that'll give you another option. Let's say though, you might have a trigger that you would want to be triggered by multiple things. So like all the players, if it's a multiplayer thing, any player that enters that trigger volume, I want to trigger the cutscene. Or any enemies that enter the trap, trigger the trap. So let's try and do that. Okay, so in order to talk about layers, we need to talk a little bit about layer masks. Again, it can get real confusing and it's beyond this assignment, and honestly, I don't know a ton about it, so I'll just show you how to get it working and what layers and masking is. So what I want to do is I want to define all the players as a type of object in a layer. So for example, maybe I'm going to create a couple more here. This one I want to be an enemy, right? And this one's going to drop down as well. So what I can do is I can go to my player, I can define a layer. You have some existing ones right here, but let's say add layer, and on player layer 6, we're going to say player, and on layer 7, we'll say enemy. You could have your own, you could make your own in different projects. You know, for my reusable trigger volume, this isn't really tied to it. It'll just allow you to specify layers if you have them in your level. So I have player and I have enemy. So what I want to do is I want to tag all my players as players. So player, you know, you could have pickup objects that only the player can pick up, but not the enemy. So you don't want the enemy colliders and the pickup colliders to even intersect. Layers in physics can get pretty confusing, but it's pretty cool. So my enemy, I want to be on the enemy layer. Okay, so player, layer, enemy, layer. All right, right now, all of them should trigger it unless we have a specific object, which we don't. Let's turn off one shot. All of them should trigger it. Okay, entered. We played the cutscene 3 times. Not great. All right, so what we want to do is we want to check and say, this other object that entered the trigger volume, what layer are you in, and is that in my list of allowed layers? So that's what we want to do conceptually. So in order to do that, let's come back into here. And first we need to allow the designer to specify what layers are allowed inside this trigger. So to do that, we're going to make a, right here under filters, give that some space. This is called a layer mask. Private layer mask, layers to detect. So I'm going to give this a default. Let me show you first if I don't give this a default. When I open this up and it recompiles, if I don't give it a default, it's not going to detect anything. And that's really not useful to me because if it's not detecting anything, then why even have it? So something that I like to do is default this to equal. Now this isn't going to make sense yet, but if you say is equal to -1, let's leave a little comment here. Default to everything. So the layers that we can detect, if you click this little drop down right here, you see it didn't change because we already created it and it recompiled. We have the option of detecting all layers, detecting no layers, or detecting any one of these that we specify. Now the cool thing about layers is we can actually do multiple, right? We could detect player and enemy and water, but not UI or default or whatever. So it's pretty cool. Like we can actually do multiple different layers or any combination of layers that we want. Now that's the upside of layer masking. The downside is it can get very confusing to drive this in code because we have to do something called bit shifting and keeping track of a lot of zeros and ones, which is not very fun. So instead of nothing, I'm just going to say by default, detect everything. I don't care, right? Like allow everything unless we specify this object, right? So that's one thing we could do. Or we could find different combinations. But I think, to me, it makes sense to detect everything by default, and then after that, we can specify further. So that is going to be something that the designer can set. This trigger volume, only enemies can detect. This trigger volume, only players can detect, or whatever. So this is our filter. Now, in order to actually do this, it's a little bit more complicated. You'll notice that, you know, because I'm setting the default to -1, if you let yours compile, it, you know, already it's already set to nothing. So just make sure you click on everything if you haven't already. Then we're gonna come back into here. And now we actually have to do our filter, right? So we've gotten this far. Now I'm gonna I'm gonna be straightforward with y'all. This line of code is real weird because there's something called bit shifting. Like if I type 1.8 or something, bit shifting. I don't even know if I want to try to explain this. It's moving zeros and ones around into different spots. So like you'll have a long string of characters like 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, whatever. We're just kind of manipulating that by bit shifting our values with like this. We have to do some of this with layer masking, and the easiest way to understand it is just to go read a lot online and look at some examples. So I'm just going to show you what I ended up with in order to get this to work. All right, so if we're going to call this layers to detect, and what we want to do is we want to detect if the object that enters is not inside of this list of valid layers, then return. If layers to detect is not equal to, here's the weird part, the list of current layers that are valid. I honestly can't remember this operator. And then inside of here, we're going to bit shift other dot game object dot layer. Okay, so we're going to get the other game objects layer, right? This other game object layer. We're going to use that and test it against the layers to detect. So you don't have to understand what this means. Just know that we are testing if this object is inside of the layers to detect. If this statement is not true, right, we can't create the same result, then return. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's just a weird bit of code. We're missing a parentheses. Sorry. Just know that the term is called bit shifting and layer masks, and you can read more about that later. Let's leave a comment because this one warrants it. If game object is not in our valid layers specified, return. All right. I think that'll do it. Let's actually make sure that this works. So we have our specific objects, we have layers to detect, and you can actually combine these and create even more filters if you want. If we don't have a specific game object, okay, layers to detect, everything should detect all three of these, right? Player, 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 enemy. I'm actually going to get rid of this cutscene there, just so we can see it easier. Entered, entered, entered. Okay, cool. Now, this player is on a player layer. This player is on a player layer. This enemy is on the enemy layer. So let's see what happens here. We have our trigger volume, layers to detect everything. So instead, we're not going to detect anything except for the player. So think about what this will do. This should give us 2 entered, right? Because we have 2 players. So let's try that. Okay, 2 entered. Let's try the player and the enemy only, right? We can combine these. So detect both. We should see 3. Okay, good. Now let's try only the enemy. Only 1. Okay, great. So this allows us to actually specify groupings of things that are in a certain layer that can trigger our cutscene, which is pretty useful. Again, if you have multiple players and or something that only affects enemies or whatever, it's pretty useful to be able to detect all of them instead of looking for a very specific type. So, you know, I think that'll do it for my reusable trigger. I know that there's a few things in here that are a little weird. If we wanted to keep expanding on this, I would definitely begin grouping things. So this could be a like validate object method or something that we could reuse. But I think for now, you know, this is a good starting point that I can reuse my trigger, and then I can continue to add functionality in the future. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to make this trigger volume something separate that we can package up and reuse in our future projects. So if we come down here, let's make a new folder. We'll call this trigger volume. Okay, and inside of that, we're going to put our trigger volume scripts, right? We're going to isolate all the things that were just for testing and the things that we want to keep. So we have our trigger volume, and now we want to turn this into a prefab. Okay, so trigger volume requires a trigger volume script, something that comes with Unity, Okay, so this is all self-contained. Great. Make sure that your prefab is set up to the defaults you want. So I'm going to put this back on everything. Gizmo color, yes, yes. Probably one shot. Okay, so I think this is exactly how we want it. All right. You could probably also do something like this, 111. Double check that. Okay, great. Yeah, so now if we ever wanted to, we could actually come in here and export that out. So for example, over here, if we wanted to export that out as the Unity package, you could right click this folder here, export package, uncheck that so that we just get this folder right here. And if you export that, we can save this wherever you want. Not inside of game. Let's save this inside of just packages over here is fine. We'll just call this trigger volume. Okay. So you could actually just pull the scripts if you want, but saving out the package like this, what's kind of neat is if I come into a different Unity project, you should drag and drop this into the project folder. And if you wanted to import it, these would pop up, but since I already have it in here, actually, let me show you. Since I already exported that, I'm going to delete that. And so now, because I have this separate Unity package, I can actually drag this in, pretend this is a new project, right? And then I can import this just how it is, import, and you can bring that into a brand new Unity project, which is pretty neat. So it's its own isolated contained folder. You can, start dragging these in your scene now and reuse it however you want. So hopefully this helped you out, and hopefully you're inspired of other things you might want to add here. Like maybe you also want to do things on exit, for example. Maybe you want even further filters. Maybe you want other options for visualization or whatever. It's all up to you. This is reusable enough that you can start doing things with it. So hopefully you learned a lot doing this, building this little modular trigger.